The bride's eyes were perfect circles of absolute black, and they were watching the archivist through 122 years of darkness. Clara Ashford would later say she felt them before she saw them, a pressure against her skull, gentle as a hand upon glass. If stories like this remind you how easily history hides its secrets, hit that like button and subscribe so more forgotten moments can be brought back to light. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and whether you think we'll ever know the full truth behind what really happened. Enjoy the story. It began as most resurrections do, with dust and forgotten things. The spring of 2024 brought an unusual donation to the Regional Heritage Museum in Somerset. 3 cardboard boxes sealed with masking tape that had turned amber with age, each filled with glass plate negatives wrapped in newspaper from 1903. The donor, an elderly solicitor settling an estate, knew only that they'd been discovered in the attic of a demolished rectory, preserved by accident in the dry darkness between rafters. Clara, head of the museum's digital restoration department, lifted the first plate to the light and saw the shimmer of silver halide, that precious chemical ghost that holds the dead in suspension. Wedding portraits, she noted in her log. Small English town, Edwardian era, approximately 1900 to 1910. She began with the formal portrait, the kind every family of modest means would have commissioned to mark their most significant day. The composition was classical, a young couple centered in the frame, surrounded by relations in their finest black suits and high-collared dresses, arranged in tiers like a living pyramid before the stone arch of what appeared to be a church entrance. The groom stood rigid, his hand upon the bride's shoulder with that particular tension of men unaccustomed to being touched with ceremony. The bride wore white, as was becoming fashionable in those years, her gown simple but well-made, her veil a cascade of delicate lace, obscuring her face in the manner considered proper and modest. Clara mounted the negative in the scanner, adjusting the resolution to capture every microscopic detail. The process was meditative, almost sacred. She'd always thought of herself as a resurrectionist of sorts, bringing the dead back into light, restoring them to the sight of the living. As the high-resolution image loaded onto her screen, she began the painstaking work of digital restoration, removing the oxidation spots, the scratches, the accumulated grime of a century. She adjusted the contrast, revealing the texture of fabric, the grain of stone, the subtle variations in skin tone that separated one ant from another. Then she enhanced the veil detail. The layers of digital noise fell away, and the bride's face emerged with sudden, shocking clarity. Clara's hand froze on the mouse. The eyes, they were wrong, not in the way that old photographs often render eyes strange, those early emulsions struggling with the complexity of the human gaze. These were perfectly round, impossibly dark, and they stared forward with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the layers of time and glass and light itself. No iris, no white, no reflection, just 2 wells of absolute black, geometrically precise. A lens artifact, Clara told herself, though her hands had gone cold. Some quirk of the old equipment, a reflection in the glass, a double exposure where shadow overlapped exactly where eyes should be. She'd seen stranger things in damaged negatives. She opened the next file from the sequence. Wedding photographers in that era typically took multiple exposures of the formal portrait, knowing at least one might be ruined by movement or mechanical failure. The second image loaded. Same composition, same arrangement of bodies, presumably taken mere seconds after the first. And yet the bride's head had turned, just slightly. The angle of her veil shifted perhaps 3 degrees to the right, toward the camera, toward Clara across 122 years. Those black circle eyes now pointed directly at the lens. Clara pushed back from her desk, her chair rolling until it struck the wall. The negatives were glass, permanent, unchanging. There could be no movement between them beyond what the subjects themselves had done during the exposure. But everyone else in the frame stood absolutely still. Not even the flutter of a hand or the shift of weight that usually marked sequential photographs. Only the bride had moved. Only her eyes had tracked. She worked late that evening, long after the other archivists had gone home. The museum settling into its nighttime silence, broken only by the hum of computers and the distant settling of old wood. She isolated the bride's face, magnifying it until the pixels became visible, searching for evidence of tampering, of damage, of any rational explanation. The technology didn't lie. The image was authentic, undoctored, a genuine record of light that had fallen upon silver over a century before. Clara saved the file and whispered to the empty room, her voice small and uncertain, "She's looking at us." The question followed her home through dark streets, climbed the stairs to her flat, and waited beside her bed while she failed to sleep. Who was this bride, and what had happened on that distant day? Morning brought the particular clarity that comes after sleepless nights, when exhaustion burns away the protective layers of skepticism and leaves only raw curiosity. Clara arrived at the museum an hour early, pulled the donation records, and began to trace the photograph's origin. The rectory had stood in Ashby Hollow, a name that stirred vague recognition, one of those small mining towns that had bloomed briefly with the coal boom and then withered when the seams ran out. She pulled up census records, parish registers, local histories. Ashby Hollow appeared in documents until 1910, then simply stopped, as though someone had drawn a line through its existence. The wedding, she learned from a yellowed newspaper clipping preserved in the Somerset archives, had been held on the 16th of September, 1902. The groom was Reverend Jonathan Hale, aged 28, newly appointed to St. Cuthbert's Church after completing his theological studies in Oxford. The bride, Eveline Hartwell, aged 21, was the daughter of Thomas Hartwell, owner of the town's largest mercantile business. The newspaper described it as a union that brightens the prospects of our parish, suggesting that Eveline's modest wealth would support Jonathan's ministry in that poor mining town. There was a photograph accompanying the article, the same formal portrait Clara had been restoring, reproduced on newsprint, though the resolution was too poor to show the strange quality of Eveline's eyes. The caption read, "The marriage that united the parish, Reverend and Mrs. Hale to guide Ashby Hollow into the new century." Clara pulled the parish registers next, expecting to find the usual record-keeping: births, marriages, deaths, the rhythmic documentation of a community's existence. Reverend Hale's entries began in September of 1902, his handwriting precise and scholarly, recording christenings and burials with appropriate solemnity. But Eveline's name appeared only once, in the marriage register itself. No mentions of her involvement in church activities, no records of children, no indication that a reverend's wife had lived in that house at all. Then, in November of 1902, just 2 months after the wedding, the entries changed. Hale's handwriting grew cramped, pressed hard into the paper. He recorded a burial. Female, unknown, found in the river, age approximately 20 years. May God have mercy. After that, nothing about Eveline. The registers continued, christenings, marriages, Sunday attendance, but the reverend's wife had simply vanished from the written record. Clara spent the morning making calls, tracking down descendants of Ashby Hollow families, most of them scattered now across England and beyond. An elderly woman in Bristol, whose grandmother had lived there as a child, said, "Oh yes, there were stories about the reverend's wife. She left suddenly, they said. Went back to her family in the south, some claimed, though others thought she'd run off entirely. Caused quite a scandal, a reverend's wife abandoning her post." But there were no records of Eveline Hartwell returning to her family. No travel documents, no letters, no trace of her existence beyond that September day. Clara requested the complete set of wedding photographs from the donation boxes, her hands trembling slightly as she opened each protective envelope. 12 photographs in total. The formal portrait she'd already seen. A shot of the church exterior, sunlight harsh on stone. Eveline standing alone by the altar, her veil down, her face obscured, the reception gathering in what appeared to be the church hall. And in each one, in every single frame, where Eveline's face was even partially visible through the lace, those black circle eyes pointed in a different direction. Not randomly, Clara traced the angles and realized they were tracking something, following some movement across the sequence of images, as though Eveline had been watching something move through the church, something the camera hadn't captured. The obsession settled into Clara's bones like winter cold. She worked through lunch, through dinner, into the evening again, creating a timeline, mapping the photographs, trying to understand. She called the Somerset Archives and requested access to any remaining documentation from Ashby Hollow. A helpful archivist mentioned there was one box they hadn't yet catalogued, personal effects donated from the Hartwell estate when it was liquidated in 1973. At 4 in the afternoon, Clara held the formal portrait up to the light again, turning it to examine the backing board. It had been professionally mounted, the photograph glued to thick cardboard, then framed. But time had loosened the adhesive around the edges. She worked gently with a conservation spatula, lifting the corner, when something white appeared in the gap. A folded piece of paper, brittle as a moth's wing. She unfolded it with forceps, her breathing shallow. The handwriting was shaky, written in pencil that had faded to gray. The date, April 1903. The message, do not bring her image to light. No signature, no explanation. Just that warning, hidden for 121 years behind the face of a bride whose eyes watched everything. Clara sat in the archive's dim light, the note trembling in her hands, and asked the silence. Why was Eveline erased from every record, and why forbid her image to be seen? The box from the Hartwell estate arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in brown paper and bureaucratic apologies for the delay. Clara signed for it in the museum's loading bay, noting how light it was, how little remained of a family that had once been prosperous enough to unite parishes through marriage. She carried it to her office and opened it with the ceremony such moments deserved. Scissors carefully cutting the tape, the cardboard flaps folding back to reveal tissue paper gone, the yellow of old ivory. Inside, a woman's life compressed into objects. A silver hairbrush with a few strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. A string of freshwater pearls that had gone dull with age. Letters tied with ribbon. The ink faded but still legible. Pressed flowers between sheets of wax paper. Their colors leached away to brown ghosts of what they'd been. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of embroidered linen, a small leather-bound journal with a brass clasp. Clara lifted the journal as though it might dissolve at her touch. The leather was soft, worn smooth by hands that had held it daily. Eveline Hartwell, 1899 to 1902, embossed in gold on the cover, though the gilding had mostly flaked away. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was round and careful, the script of a young woman educated enough to write, but not trained in the flourishes of the upper classes. January 1st, 1899. Father gave me this journal for the new year. He says a lady should record her thoughts and observations, that it trains the mind to clarity. I shall try my best to be worthy of it. Clara read through the early entries, observations about weather, descriptions of shopping trips to Bath, small domestic dramas of a provincial merchant's daughter. Eveline wrote about learning to manage household accounts, about her younger brother's trouble with mathematics, about the new styles from London that seemed both scandalous and thrilling. The voice was sweet, earnest, occasionally funny. A real person, Clara thought. Not just eyes in a photograph, but someone who had worried about whether her dress was fashionable, who had loved her family, who had hoped for ordinary happiness. The entries grew more frequent in 1902. Eveline wrote about meeting Jonathan Hale, about his serious manner and kind eyes, about how he spoke of bringing light to dark places. He asked Father for permission to court me today. I think I shall like being a reverend's wife. It seems a useful sort of life, helping people, doing good works. Mother says I have always been too concerned with others' troubles. Perhaps this is my calling. The wedding preparations dominated the spring and summer entries. Eveline wrote about choosing fabric for her gown, about learning to make altar bread, about memorizing the prayers that would be part of her new role. Jonathan says a reverend's wife must be above reproach, a beacon of virtue for the parish. Sometimes the responsibility feels heavy, but I shall learn. Then came the entry from September 12, 1902, 4 days before the wedding. The handwriting was less careful, as though written in haste or distress. Strange dreams these past nights. I wake feeling watched, though my room is empty. Jonathan says it is only nervousness, that many brides feel unsettled before their vows. But the church, when I went there yesterday to practice walking down the aisle, I heard whispers in the vestry. No words I could understand, just the sound of many voices speaking softly, urgently. Jonathan was in his study. The church was empty. Yet I felt eyes upon me that were not my own, a weight of attention that made my skin prickle. I told Jonathan, and he grew very quiet. He said I must pray for strength, that the devil often tests those who would serve the Lord. The next entry, September 14th. Jonathan has asked me to fast before the wedding. He says it will purify me, prepare me for the sacrament of marriage. I grow lightheaded with hunger, but I trust his guidance. Today he showed me the veil I am to wear. His mother's, he said, blessed by a bishop. It is beautiful, delicate as spider silk, but when I touched it I felt I cannot describe it, a coldness that went deeper than touch. He says I imagine things, that my mind is weakened by fasting. Perhaps he is right. September 15th, the day before the wedding, the handwriting barely legible. Cannot sleep. The voice that hums through the church walls follows me even here. It sings of a light that burns away sin, that purifies through fire and darkness. Jonathan came tonight and prayed over me for hours, his hands on my head, pushing down until my neck ached. He kept saying, "Let the darkness out, let the light in." But what darkness? I am only Eveline, only myself, and I am so tired. The entry ended abruptly mid-page. Below it, in different ink, as though added later, a final fragment. He said the light of the Lord would cleanse me, but the light burned black. Clara turned the page, expecting the wedding day entry, but the remaining pages were blank. She flipped through them. Nothing. The journal simply stopped the night before Eveline became Mrs. Hale, as though the person who had written those entries had ceased to exist at the altar. Among the letters, Clara found one from Jonathan, addressed to Eveline in the weeks after their engagement. The paper was heavy, expensive, the handwriting educated and precise. "My dearest Eveline, I have prayed for guidance regarding our union, and the Lord has shown me that you are the vessel through which his light shall shine in Ashby Hollow. There is a purity in you that must be protected, preserved, even if you yourself do not yet understand its importance. I will be your shepherd, and you shall be my flock. Together we shall drive out the shadows." Another letter, this one torn, water-stained, dated October 19th, 02, a month after the wedding. Only fragments remained legible. Her salvation requires silence. What was done was necessary. The parish must not know. I have failed in my duty, but succeeded in hers. May God forgive. Clara sat with these remnants spread across her desk like the pieces of a broken mirror, each one reflecting a fragment of truth, but none showing the whole picture. She was reading not delusion but evidence, evidence of something ritualistic, methodical, carried out under the banner of faith. Eveline had trusted Jonathan, had wanted to be good, to be worthy, to serve. And that trust had led her somewhere from which she'd never returned. The photograph emerged from her printer, the formal portrait enhanced and clarified. Clara studied the groom's face, seeing now what she'd missed before. The tension in his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders, the hand on Eveline's shoulder gripping perhaps too tightly, and Eveline, veiled and watching, those black eyes seeing everything, saying nothing. Clara whispered to the dead girl trapped in silver and light. What salvation were you subjected to, and by whom? The Somerset archives held records that other institutions had deemed too mundane to preserve. Church choir logs, account books, even the orders of service for weddings and funerals. Clara requested everything from St. Cuthbert's Church, Ashby Hollow, September through December 1902. The archivist brought her 3 folders apologizing for the disorganization. The church had closed in 1914, and its records had been stored in a diocesan warehouse until someone remembered they existed. Clara opened the first folder and found what she'd been seeking: contemporary accounts of the wedding day. The Ashby Hollow Gazette had printed a full description. The 16th of September brought cloudless skies and joyful hearts as Reverend Jonathan Hale wed Miss Eveline Hartwell in a service of radiant beauty. The bride entered to the singing of "O Perfect Love," her countenance serene beneath her antique veil. The ceremony proceeded with all due solemnity, Reverend Hale conducting his own vows with remarkable composure. The congregation departed in high spirits, confident in the strength of this union. But the church's own choir log told a different story. The music director had carefully noted each hymn performed that day. "O Perfect Love" for the processional, yes, but then "Abide With Me," a funeral hymn for the vows themselves. "Lead Kindly Light" during the signing of the register, another song of death and guidance through darkness. And the recessional, "The Day Thou Gavest, Lord," is ended. Not celebration but conclusion, not beginning but ending. Clara cross-referenced the newspaper account with the order of service preserved in the church files. The program listed standard wedding hymns, but the choir log recorded what was actually sung. Someone had changed the music. Someone had turned a wedding into a funeral mass while maintaining the appearance of celebration. She moved to the photographs next, examining each with forensic attention. The formal portrait, the one that had started everything, included a mirror mounted on the church wall behind the wedding party. She'd noticed it before but hadn't thought to examine it closely. She enhanced that section of the image, running it through every filter her software offered, removing glare and adjusting contrast until the reflection became visible. And there, in the silvered glass of that long-ago mirror, she saw what the camera had not directly captured: Eveline's face, pale and still, her veil thrown back just enough to reveal her expression. While everyone else in the photograph smiled or maintained the stern dignity expected of formal portraits, Eveline's face was blank. Not smiling, not frowning, simply absent of animation, her mouth slightly open, her eyes, those terrible black circles, staring forward with no recognition of the people surrounding her, no awareness of the camera, no consciousness in them at all. Clara's hands shook as she zoomed in further. In the corner of the mirror's reflection, barely visible, was a hand. It held the edge of Eveline's veil, adjusting it, positioning it, but the hand belonged to no one visible in the direct photograph. It simply appeared from outside the frame, from somewhere the camera wasn't pointed, a gloved hand making sure the bride's veil obscured what the photograph was meant to hide. She worked through the night, analyzing each photograph, finding small inconsistencies, shadows that fell wrong, reflections that showed things the camera shouldn't have captured. In one image, Eveline stood by the altar alone, but the train of her dress was lifted, as though someone held it, though no one was visible. In another, taken during the reception, her hand rested on a table, and beneath it, just visible in the enhanced image, were bruises circling her wrist like a bracelet of fingerprints. At 3 a.m, Clara's screen flickered, just once, but enough to make her look up. The formal portrait was still displayed, and in that moment of electrical disruption, something changed. The black circles of Eveline's eyes seemed to shift, to focus, to look not at the camera that had captured her, but at the screen that now displayed her. At Clara, at this moment 122 years later. Clara stood abruptly, her chair clattering backward. The screen stabilized. The image remained unchanged, but the feeling persisted, that sense of being watched, of attention focused through time and glass and silver emulsion, of someone reaching across the years trying to tell a story that had been deliberately silenced. She dreamed that night, fitfully, on the couch in her office, where she'd collapsed from exhaustion. In the dream, she stood in St. Cuthbert's Church, though she'd never seen it except in photographs. The stone walls rose around her, cold and damp. Light fell through stained glass in colors of blood and bruises, and before the altar stood Eveline, her veil down, her white gown bright against the shadows. Clara tried to speak, but Eveline lifted one finger to her lips. Silence. Then the bride raised her veil slowly, and Clara saw her face, young and beautiful and utterly terrified. The black circles were not eyes but holes, empty places where eyes should have been, and through them Clara could see the altar, the cross, the church itself, as though Eveline had been erased from the inside out, made into nothing but a frame for viewing what stood behind her. The bride's mouth moved, forming words without sound. "You see me now." Clara woke, gasping, the office lights harsh after the dream's shadows. The computer had gone into sleep mode. She touched the keyboard, and the screen illuminated, showing the photograph still displayed. Eveline, frozen in silver, her veil obscuring and revealing, her eyes watching through 122 years of darkness. The question burned: what really happened during that ceremony, and why does Eveline's presence still react to being seen? The confession existed. Clara learned about it through patient archaeology, following references in footnotes, tracking marginalia in church records, piecing together hints from historians who'd studied religious mania in Edwardian England. A sealed document, they said, preserved in the diocesan archives at Wells, too sensitive to have been destroyed, but too disturbing to be made public. Written by Reverend Jonathan Hale, dated December 1902, 3 months after his wedding. It took Clara 2 weeks to secure permission to view it, 2 weeks of formal requests and academic justifications, and promises to handle the material with appropriate discretion. The diocesan archivist who brought her the document was an elderly priest with kind eyes who said only, "This was written by a man in great spiritual distress. Whatever you find, please remember he believed he was doing God's work." The confession was written on foolscap paper, both sides of each page covered in handwriting that deteriorated as it progressed, starting precise and ending in a barely controlled scrawl. Clara photographed each page before reading, her training overriding her urgency. Then she began. "I write this account as testament and warning, though I pray it shall never be read while I yet live. My name is Jonathan Hale, Reverend of St. Cuthbert's Church, Ashby Hollow, and I have committed a sin in the name of salvation. May God judge whether my soul deserves mercy. I met Eveline Hartwell in the spring of 1902 and saw immediately what others could not, that she carried within her a darkness, a shadow in her soul that no prayer seemed to touch. When she smiled, I saw behind her eyes a sorrow so profound it seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. When she spoke of ordinary things, I heard beneath her words a whisper of despair. The devil, I believed, had touched her, had planted in her heart a seed of spiritual corruption that would, if left untreated, consume her utterly. I sought guidance from my former mentor, Bishop Carlisle, who was learned in matters of the soul's affliction. He wrote to me of cases where sin could manifest physically, where the darkness within could be seen in the eyes as a shadow, as an absence of light. He spoke of a ritual, an exorcism disguised as holy matrimony, whereby a woman could be bound to righteousness through the sacrament of marriage. The veil, blessed and sanctified, would seal the corruption within, and the marriage vows would transfer her spiritual custody to her husband, who would guard her from the darkness she carried. I loved Eveline. This I must confess. I loved her and believed I could save her from herself. When her father agreed to our union, I saw it as divine providence. I began the preparations, the fasting, the prayers, the gradual weakening of her body so that her spirit might be more easily purified. She trusted me. This is the burden I shall carry all my days. She trusted me, and I used that trust to lead her to the altar, not as a bride, but as a patient, not for marriage, but for cure. The ceremony proceeded as planned. The choir sang the hymns I had chosen, songs of death and rebirth, of darkness yielding to light. I placed upon her head the veil that Bishop Carlisle had blessed, and I spoke the words of the marriage service while underneath, in whispers, I recited the prayers of exorcism. I bound her to me, to the church, to God, believing that through this binding her darkness would be contained. But something went wrong. I saw it in her eyes. Even through the veil they changed, darkening, the pupils dilating until they seemed to consume all light. She did not scream. She did not fight. She simply stared at me with those eyes that had gone black and round as coins, and I saw in them not the devil departing, but something breaking, something essential fracturing under the weight of what I had done. The light left her. I can describe it no other way. One moment she stood before me, Eveline, my bride, my patient, my responsibility. The next, she was hollow, a shell, her eyes dark windows into emptiness. She completed the ceremony mechanically, speaking the vows I had taught her, signing the register with a hand I guided, but she was no longer present in the body that performed these actions. I took her to the rectory and laid her in the bed I had prepared. She did not speak for 3 days. On the 4th day she rose and walked to the church, and there I found her before the altar, kneeling in her wedding gown, her veil still upon her head, her black eyes staring at the cross. I tried to feed her, to bring her back to herself, but she would not respond. She knelt there for 7 days without sleeping or eating or speaking, and on the 8th day she fell. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped. The coroner asked no questions. A weak heart, too much excitement, the strains of new marriage. I buried her beneath the choir, where the most sacred hymns are sung, believing that the constant prayers might finally bring her peace. I commissioned the wedding photographs to be mounted and distributed, to show the parish that all had been well, that the marriage had been proper and joyful. I wrote to her family that she had died suddenly of illness. I sealed her name from the parish records so that no one would ask questions, so that no one would know what I had done in the name of righteousness. But her eyes, they followed me from the photographs. When I hung our wedding portrait in the rectory, I would wake in the night feeling watched. I turned the photograph to face the wall, but still I felt her gaze. I removed it to the church, but parishioners began to comment on the bride's strange expression. I sealed the photographs in a box, but even hidden, even buried under other documents, I knew she was watching, waiting, bearing witness to the man who had broken her in the name of God. I write this so that if anyone finds these images, they will understand. Eveline Hartwell was not possessed by demons. The darkness in her eyes was sorrow, only sorrow, the ordinary pain of a young woman afraid of the future, uncertain of her place in the world. I saw sin where there was only human feeling. I performed exorcism where only kindness was needed. I sealed her soul behind a blessed veil and watched the light die in her eyes. Her image moves in the photographs. I do not expect anyone to believe this. I barely believe it myself, but I see it in frame after frame. Her gaze shifts, tracking something I cannot see, watching something that watches her. I believe her soul is trapped there, in the silver and glass. In the moment I destroyed her, the photographer captured not a wedding but a murder, and the evidence stares back at me from every angle, in every image, black eyes accusing, black eyes asking why. May God forgive me, may Eveline forgive me, may whoever reads this understand that faith without compassion is the cruelest form of violence, and that I committed that violence upon someone who had asked only to be loved. The confession ended there, unsigned, the last page stained with something that might have been tears or might have been the damp of long storage. Clara sat in the archives reading room, surrounded by the accumulated documents of failed faith, and wept for Eveline Hartwell, who had wanted only to be a reverend's wife, to do good works, to help people, and whose trust had led her to an altar where love and cruelty became indistinguishable. Jonathan Hale remained as Reverend of St. Cuthbert's until 1914, when the mine collapse that killed 37 men convinced the remaining families to abandon Ashby Hollow. He moved to a parish in Devon and died in 1928. His obituary described him as a man of deep faith and private sorrows. Clara understood now what she'd been seeing in the photographs. Not possession, not supernatural horror, but documentation of psychological murder dressed in holy vestments. The black circle eyes were the pupils of someone whose consciousness had retreated under unbearable stress, someone who had dissociated so completely that what the camera captured was only the shell remaining. The movement between frames was real Eveline, trapped in that dissociative state, responding to stimuli without awareness, her gaze tracking movement like an automaton, her body performing the ceremony while her mind fled to somewhere safer. The photographs were taken after the ceremony, staged to hide what Jonathan had done, but they captured the truth anyway. The camera, indifferent to intention, recorded evidence: the blank expression in the mirror's reflection, the bruises on her wrist, the way her body held itself like a puppet whose strings were barely supporting its weight, and her eyes, enormous and empty, watching but not seeing, bearing witness to her own dissolution. Clara looked at the formal portrait again, seeing it now with terrible clarity. This was not a haunting. This was testimony. Eveline's image reacted to being seen because Clara was finally, after 122 years, truly looking at her, not at a ghost or a mystery, but at a woman who had been destroyed and whose evidence of destruction had been hidden behind a veil and sealed in a box and forgotten. The question that remained was simpler than supernatural. If she was buried beneath the choir, how did her truth survive, and why does it still demand to be witnessed? St. Cuthbert's Church no longer existed, not really. Clara drove to Ashby Hollow on a gray October morning, following a map that referenced roads no longer maintained, passing through a landscape that had been beautiful once before the mines scarred it. The town itself had been mostly demolished in the 1960s, the buildings deemed unstable, the land reclaimed by the Moor. But the church remained, or part of it. Stone walls without a roof, windows like empty eyes, the floor overgrown with moss and wildflowers. She parked on what had once been the high street and walked the last quarter-mile, her equipment bag heavy on her shoulder. Rooks called from the surrounding trees, their voices harsh in the stillness. The church stood at the edge of the old town, and as Clara approached, she felt again that sensation of being watched, though the windows were empty and the doorway was just a gap in the stone where a door had once hung. The interior was open to the sky, rain and time having collapsed the roof decades before. The floor was flagstone, some of it lifted by roots, some of it still level and smooth. Clara could make out where the altar had stood, where the pews had been arranged, and there, along the north wall, the remnants of the choir, a raised platform of stone, partially sunken now, the floor beneath it hollow-sounding when she tapped it with her foot. She'd brought a pry bar, a flashlight, a sense that she was committing either archaeology or desecration and wasn't sure which. The flagstones in the choir area had gaps between them, widened by a century of freeze and thaw. She worked the pry bar into the largest gap and levered upward. The stone lifted more easily than she'd expected, revealing darkness beneath. The vault was small, perhaps 6 feet long and 3 wide, lined with brick gone white with mineral deposits. Clara shone her flashlight into the space and saw the remnants of what had been buried there. Fragments of fabric, white and rotting, spread across the floor of the vault like spilled milk. The shapes of bones, small and delicate, that might have been hands. And among the decay, things that had not rotted, a tarnished silver cross, a pearl necklace, and at the far end, a small silver hand mirror, its face cracked across the center. Clara climbed down into the vault, her heart hammering. The fabric was Eveline's wedding gown. She knew it with certainty. The lace of the veil still faintly visible, though most of it had dissolved into the earth. The veil that Jonathan had blessed, that he'd used to seal what he called darkness, that had been the instrument of Eveline's destruction. She lifted the mirror carefully, turning it to catch the light from above. The glass was cracked but still reflective, and in it she saw her own face, pale and shadowed. She angled it toward the opening of the vault, toward the sky, and something extraordinary happened. The mirror even turned away from the church's remains, even facing only empty sky, reflected the interior of St. Cuthbert's as it had been. Not as it was now, roofless and ruined, but as it had appeared in the photographs, whole and complete. Pews arranged in neat rows, candles burning on the altar, and there, at the altar, a figure in white, veil down, black circle eyes staring into the mirror, as though she'd been waiting 122 years for someone to find it. Clara's hands shook. She adjusted the angle, and the reflection shifted. Now she saw the wedding party arranged for the formal portrait, saw Jonathan's hand on Eveline's shoulder, saw the photographer beneath his black cloth preparing the exposure. The mirror had captured and held that day, kept it preserved in silver amalgam and glass, bearing witness long after the participants had died and the building itself had fallen. She realized the truth with a clarity that felt like revelation. The eyes in the photographs were not supernatural. They were reflections. Eveline, trapped in her dissociative state, had been holding or looking at this mirror during the ceremony. The black circles were the reflection of her own pupils, captured in the mirror's surface and then reflected again in the camera's lens, a double reflection that created those perfect, impossible circles. The mirror had been with her at the altar, perhaps held as part of the ritual Jonathan had devised, and it had captured everything, her terror, her dissolution, the moment her mind fled from what was being done to her body. The mirror reflected not ghosts, but memory. Not hauntings, but history preserved in silver and light. And as Clara held it, angling it this way and that, watching the past flicker across its cracked surface, she understood that Eveline had not been trying to frighten anyone. She had been trying to show them. Look at me, see what was done. Bear witness. Clara climbed from the vault with the mirror wrapped in her jacket. As she emerged into the gray daylight, she felt rather than saw a change in the air, a loosening of tension, as though something that had been held taut for over a century had finally released. She turned back to look at the church ruins, and for just a moment, perhaps a trick of light, perhaps something else, she saw in the empty doorway the silhouette of a woman in white, her veil lifted, her face clear and young, and finally at peace. The figure raised one hand, and Clara understood it as both farewell and permission. Tell them, show them. Let the truth be seen. She whispered to the empty church and the watching rooks and the ghost of a girl who had died for someone else's idea of righteousness. I see you. I promise you, everyone will see you. The silhouette faded like breath on glass. The church stood empty again, just stone and moss and the slow reclamation of nature. But Clara carried with her the mirror, the evidence, the proof that Eveline Hartwell had existed, had suffered, had left behind testimony in silver and reflection and the physics of light. The question she'd been asking transformed in that moment from curiosity to obligation. Can the truth be told without repeating the harm that silenced her? The exhibition opened on the 16th of September 2024, exactly 122 years after Eveline Hartwell walked down the aisle of St. Cuthbert's Church and emerged destroyed. Clara had titled it, "The Wedding That Never Ended, Testimony in Light and Silver," and it occupied the museum's main gallery, walls painted a soft gray that made the photographs glow as though lit from within. She had restored every image, not by correcting them, but by revealing them, enhancing the details that time and intention had obscured, bringing into clarity what had been hidden. The formal portrait hung at the center, enormous and unavoidable, and beneath it, a placard that read, Eveline Hartwell, 1881-1902, bride, victim, witness. But Clara had done more than simply display the photographs. She'd created a narrative through careful curation, allowing Eveline to tell her own story. The journal entries were transcribed and mounted beside the images. Eveline's voice, sweet and trusting and increasingly afraid, speaking across the years. The letters from Jonathan were there too, his theological justifications displayed for what they were, the language of control dressed as care, the vocabulary of violence disguised as love. The confession occupied its own wall, the full text reproduced, every damning word preserved. Clara had hesitated over this, whether to protect Jonathan's memory, whether to show mercy to a man who had, perhaps, genuinely believed he was doing right. But then she'd remembered Eveline kneeling for 7 days before the altar until her heart stopped, and she'd printed every word. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the mirror, displayed in a climate-controlled case, positioned so that gallery lights struck it at angles similar to the light in the church that September day. And sometimes, not always, not predictably, but sometimes, visitors reported seeing reflections that shouldn't exist. A church interior where only gallery walls should appear. A figure in white just at the edge of vision. The museum's director asked Clara if it was some kind of trick, a projection, an artistic enhancement. Clara said only, "The mirror reflects what it captured. Sometimes the past is patient." The press preview brought journalists and historians and representatives from organizations that worked with victims of religious abuse. Clara watched them move through the space, watched understanding dawn on faces, watched anger and sorrow and recognition. A woman from a domestic violence charity stood before the journal entries for 20 minutes, tears streaming down her face, then turned to Clara and said, "This still happens. Different language, different century, but this still happens." Clara had known it would. That was why the final wall of the exhibition was dedicated not to Eveline alone, but to context. Statistics on coercive control, resources for people experiencing faith-based abuse, information about how systems of power use the language of salvation to justify harm. Eveline's story, Clara explained in the exhibition catalog, was not unique. It was pattern, precedent, the documented proof of how trust and faith and the desire to be good could be weaponized against those who possessed them. During the press preview, as Clara spoke about the research process, about finding Eveline's voice in the archives, the lights flickered once, just once, but enough to make everyone look up. And there, on the screen where Clara had been projecting the enhanced photographs, the image of Eveline at the altar appeared, though Clara hadn't cued it yet. The bride stood alone, her veil thrown back, and for the first time in any of the photographs, her eyes were clear, not black circles, but simply eyes, human and hazel, and looking directly at the crowd with an expression of profound relief. The image held for 3 seconds, then dissolved back to Clara's presentation slide. The room had gone silent. Someone whispered, "Did you see?" And someone else answered, "I saw." Clara didn't try to explain it. She simply said, "Eveline Hartwell deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be believed. For 122 years, she's been waiting for someone to look at her photographs and see not mystery, but testimony. I hope today we've honored that." The exhibition ran for 6 months, and more than 50,000 people came to see it. They stood before the photographs, read the journal entries, examined the mirror. Many brought flowers, leaving them at the base of the formal portrait until the gallery had to install a memorial table. Others left notes. "I believe you, Eveline. This happened to me too. Thank you for showing us. You deserved better. You are seen." Clara watched the memorial table grow, watched strangers grieve for a woman they'd never met, but whose story they recognized, and she understood that this was what Eveline had been waiting for. Not revenge, not even justice in any legal sense, but recognition, acknowledgement, the simple confirmation that what happened to her was real and wrong and witnessed. On the final day of the exhibition, as Clara supervised the careful packing of the photographs, she looked at the formal portrait one last time. Eveline stared back, her veil soft around her face, her eyes, those strange black circles that had started everything, focused somewhere just past the frame. But now, looking at her, Clara saw not horror, but humanity. A young woman who had wanted to be useful, to be good, to be loved, and who had been broken for it. As Clara lifted the portrait from the wall, she felt a warmth against her skin, as though someone had briefly touched her hand. The gallery was empty. The air conditioning hummed. But Clara smiled through sudden tears and whispered, "You're seen, Eveline. Everyone sees you now." The photograph remained inert in her hands, just silver and paper and chemistry. But Clara could have sworn she felt the faintest shift, as though something held rigid for over a century had finally relaxed its vigilance, as though after 122 years of bearing witness, Eveline could finally rest. The question dissolved. Has Eveline finally found peace, or has Clara inherited her gaze? The answer was both and neither. The truth had been told, the silence broken, but vigilance remained necessary. Someone needed to keep watching, to keep seeing, to keep bearing witness to the ways love and faith and trust could be weaponized. That work would continue. 3 weeks after the exhibition closed, On a morning when frost had turned the Somerset countryside to glass, a package arrived at Clara's office. No return address, no postage mark that she could make sense of. The paper looked old. The string binding it appeared to be actual twine, and the label was written in faded ink that shouldn't have survived transit through modern postal systems. Inside was an envelope of heavy cream paper, sealed with wax. Clara broke the seal carefully, her conservationist's training automatic even in her confusion. Inside was a single sheet, the paper handmade and decal-edged, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The handwriting was round and careful, achingly familiar from weeks spent transcribing journal entries. To the one who restores what was taken, it read. Just that, no signature, no date that Clara could discern, though she examined the paper under magnification, ran every test her equipment allowed. The ink was iron gall, authentic to the period. The paper fibers were consistent with Edwardian manufacturing, but the letter itself was impossible. No one from 1902 could have addressed it to Clara, could have known she would find those photographs, could have sealed it in an envelope that somehow survived a century and appeared only after she'd finished telling Eveline's story. Unless time folded differently around trauma, around testimony, around witnessing. Unless the act of seeing Eveline, truly seeing her, after 122 years, had created a bridge that worked in both directions. Beneath the letter was a second item wrapped in tissue paper, gone soft as cloth. Clara unwrapped it with shaking hands and found a glass plate negative, smaller than the wedding photographs, sealed in a protective envelope that bore a notation in pencil. Original exposure. Do not develop until light returns. Clara took the negative to the darkroom that night, working alone in the red-lit darkness that photographers had worked in for generations. She'd developed glass plates before. It was a standard part of archival conservation. But her hands trembled as she prepared the chemistry, as she slid the plate into the developer bath, as she watched the image emerge from transparency into visibility. The photograph showed St. Cuthbert's Church interior, the altar in soft focus behind the main subject. And there stood Eveline, her veil lifted and pinned back, her wedding gown pooling around her feet, her face clear and unmarked by the terror Clara had seen in every other image. She was smiling, not the forced smile of Victorian photography, but a genuine expression of joy, captured in a moment before anything had gone wrong, before the ceremony, before Jonathan's ritual destroyed her. Just Eveline, young and hopeful, standing in a church on her wedding day. But there was something else in the photograph, something that made Clara's breath catch. In the background, barely visible, was a silhouette. A woman in modern clothing, jeans and a sweater, hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, stood at the back of the church holding what appeared to be a camera. The figure was blurred, ghostly, but recognizable. It was Clara. Clara from 3 weeks ago, standing in the ruins of St. Cuthbert's, photographing the remnants of the choir. Clara from the present, captured in a glass plate negative from 122 years before. Time folded. The archive became a bridge, not between past and present, but between two moments of witnessing. Eveline at the beginning of her tragedy, Clara at the end of it, both of them bearing testimony, both of them holding cameras, both of them trying to preserve truth against forces that would erase it. Clara developed the image fully, fixed it, washed it, dried it with the careful attention her profession demanded, but her mind was reeling. The photograph shouldn't exist. It violated causality, logic, everything she understood about how time and light and chemistry worked. Yet here it was, undeniable evidence of something impossible. Eveline had seen Clara, had known Clara would come, had left her a message in silver and light that could only be received after the story was told, after the silence was broken, after the witnessing was complete. On the back of the plate, etched with a sharp tool into the emulsion itself, was a final message. "Thank you for the light. Now give it to others." Clara hung the photograph in her office, where she saw it every morning when she arrived and every evening when she left. Sometimes, when the light hit it at certain angles, the silhouette of the modern figure seemed to shift, to move, as though Clara, captured in that impossible photograph, was waving or nodding or simply acknowledging that the work continued. Sometimes she could swear she saw other figures in the background too, other women, other witnesses, other stories waiting to be found and restored and brought into light. She thought of Eveline often, of the girl who had wanted only to be good, who had trusted the wrong person, who had been destroyed and whose destruction had been hidden for over a century. She thought of the mirror that captured and held testimony, of the photographs that bore witness even when the living would not, of the way truth could be preserved in silver and glass and patient waiting. And she understood her work differently now. She was not just an archivist or a conservationist. She was a resurrectionist, yes, but more than that, she was a witness to witnesses, a keeper of testimony, someone who understood that the past was never truly past for those whose truths had been silenced. The exhibition traveled to other museums, to universities, to community centers in towns where faith and control still tangled in dangerous ways. Clara went with it sometimes, spoke about the research process, about finding Eveline's voice in the archives, but mostly she stayed at her museum, working through the endless boxes of donated photographs, looking for the others, for the images that held secrets, for the faces that needed to be seen, for the stories that had been sealed away and forgotten. She found them too. A Victorian asylum photograph where a woman's eyes held not madness, but terror. A family portrait from the 1930s where a child's bruises had been carefully positioned outside the frame. A wedding photo from the 1950s where the bride's smile didn't reach her eyes and her groom's hand circled her wrist like a shackle. Each one she restored, researched, contextualized. Each story she told, bringing the silenced back into voice, bringing the hidden back into light. Some of them spoke through documents, through letters and journals and confessions. Some of them spoke only through the photographs themselves, through the evidence captured by cameras wielded by people who hadn't understood what they were documenting. But all of them spoke, all of them witnessed. And Clara listened and looked and helped others see. In the red-lit darkness of her conservation darkroom, developing negatives that were sometimes a century old, Clara often thought of that impossible photograph, herself captured in glass from before she was born, bearing witness to the woman who would bear witness to her. The past developed her, and she developed the past. And in that reciprocal developing, something true emerged that neither century could contain alone. The archive, she understood, was not a tomb, but a womb. Not a place where the dead were stored, but a place where they could be reborn into visibility, into voice, into the simple dignity of being seen and believed. Every negative she developed, every image she restored, every story she brought from darkness into light was an act of resurrection. And sometimes in the quiet moments when the museum was closed and the light fell just right through her office window, Clara would look at that impossible photograph and see the two figures, Eveline at her altar, Clara in her ruins, separated by 122 years, but united in the act of witnessing. And she would understand that this was how time truly moved, not forward in a straight line, but in spirals, in circles, in patterns of testimony and recognition that connected those who saw with those who needed to be seen. In the dark room's red glow, the past developed her, and she developed the past, and both were transformed by the chemical magic of silver and light and the patient, necessary work of bearing witness to truths that powerful people would prefer to keep hidden in the dark.